a lot of times what we notice is after the exile's been healed, then the protectors sort of inherently soften in their roles and step into their preferred state.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Turning In podcast. On today's episode, Amy does a bit of a deep dive into the unburdening process. We do an overview of what that can kind of look like when it's done properly, as well as discuss the effects that it can have not only on our exiles, but also the rest of the protective system. Thank you, as always, for the support that we've been getting and that you've been lending. All of that love is so appreciated. With that, let's jump right into it. Dr. Crawford, how we doing?
I'm all right, other than this weird cough I have, but we'll see how that goes.
Yes, it is an elongated allergy season for Dr. Crawford the last few years, I think.
Yeah, elongated like last 9.5 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Today, we are talking about unburdening. So we have done all of our, kind of foundational episodes up to this point. One of the kind of more recent ones, I believe, was on burdens, but we didn't really delve into actual unburdening. So I'm intrigued, to sort of get into that a little bit. Will you start, I guess, by talking to our listeners about the main concept of unburdening and maybe some of let's start with the main concept of unburdening, and then we can kind of like get into what that means for our system and what can happen on the back end of that process in a minute. So what
sorry, I just sound like a frog. Sorry. Oh, sure I can.
So what's unburdening?
So unburdening is a concept within the IFS model where it is very kind of formulaic in its healing steps to help address the wounds, the baggage, the vulnerabilities, also known as the burdens that our parts carry. In particular, really our exiles is what the focus is, because as we remember, our exiles carry those wounds that then orient our protectors to keeping those exiles safe by whatever means necessary. And so the wounds that the exiles carry are often called burdens. And so within IFS, the next step after we connect with our protectors is to work with the exiles that they protect to help them release and let go of those burdens that they've been carrying. So that's sort of the quick and dirty as to what unburdening is. In IFS, there are steps, and we'll kind of just breeze through those a bit to help the exiles unburden. So there is actually a roadmap that we utilize, and I think the reason I think you and I both felt this episode was important was because we get a lot of questions around, okay, cool. So we've done the 6 steps, we're starting to connect with our protectors, then what? Mm-hmm. And so the unburdening is sort of the then what, right? That's the next step of really creating sustainable healing change within the system.
It's kind of like, where that long term, the shifts happen as we get to know our system and we explore, and doing the unburdening process with a, clinician practitioner. Can practitioners unburden? Practitioners can do everything. Sorry, side note. But that's scope.
That's a tricky one, right? Yes and no. They're trained how to do unburdening. And
it'll be different, probably.
It will be different. And as a therapist, ethically, I don't know that a practitioner should be unburdening. And I feel like IFS Institute is pretty aligned with that same philosophy, even though practitioners have learned the steps.
Sure. Okay. Sorry.
So
Side note
really,
question
no,
there. Yeah.
and I'm sure there are lots of practitioners doing unburdening,
Mm-hmm.
just as there are lots of therapists who think they know how to do IFS. Doing unburdenings doesn't mean they're actually doing an unburdening that's appropriate, ethical, or aligned
Fully.
with the true objectives of the process.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was
Just like
curious
I
about
have
that.
parts that are afraid of even kind of going through the steps kind of quickly, because I don't want people to assume, oh, I know how to do this now,
I
because
can
that's
do
not how
that.
it works. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes total sense. It was, yeah, a side note question as I was going on because, yeah, so going back, yours, my system, I have the experience, and our systems will shift as we get to know and create relationship with these parts. But I feel like, yeah, that unburdening and doing that deeply with, we'll say, a licensed clinician for all intents and purposes here in my life, that is where like the long-term, like true shifts
Yeah.
have taken place, and where, and you know, we can kind of get into that in our burdens episode, because you just identified the exiles as the ones that we're ultimately unburdening and focusing on in this process, and our protectors kind of come into play there as well, for sure. And that's, I think, what makes the day-to-day, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong there, but I feel like the unburdening that therefore takes place with the protectors in that system, which again we will get into, is kind of what makes that day-to-day so impactful going through the process, because then I don't have my firefighters doing this and my managers doing this to the same extremity, I suppose.
Well, yeah, and the day-to-day connection with our protectors and our exiles, sometimes when that more vulnerable energy emerges, the day-to-day connections we make that we've been really focusing on so far on the podcast are critical to help us get to this place so that our system is ready to do some unburdening, because our protectors have to trust self in order to give permission to move to the exile in which they protect. So if they don't trust us yet, they're not going to give us permission to even go into this whole, the healing steps of IFS, the unburdening process. So it's super, super important. And I do want to say that we're going to be kind of focusing on exiles here, but our protectors also carry burdens. Their burdens are just more of like responsibility, if you will. A lot of times, like, our managers carry burdens of responsibility and the loyalty to their jobs. Firefighters often carry burdens of shame in their behaviors that they engage in. So our protectors do also carry burdens. And these steps also are what we can do with the protectors if they have more to let go of after we unburden the exile they've been protecting. A lot of times what we notice is after the exile's been healed, then the protectors sort of inherently soften in their roles and step into their preferred state, because they don't really have the same job to do anymore. However, there are sometimes protectors also then need their separate moment in the sun, if you will, to have an unburdening if they're still sort of stuck or rigidly placed in their role.
You just said something really important that I want to rewind to, which is that, yeah, those protectors in that system, and that's where the day-to-day comes in. It's almost like a priming, like the day-to-day, daily practice IFS sort of principles that we've gone into and spoken about, and you shared, you know, we both shared, you know, things that we do when we're activated or on a daily basis. That's the priming that has to happen. So there's that relationship and that trust there. And I know that I've mentioned it, you've mentioned it in other episodes. I think you just mentioned it, actually, is like, ultimately it's two things. Like, is ultimately the goal in some ways, shapes, and forms of IFS to unburden, to have that shift? Yes. While also it's not about, we always talk about the bulldozing of the system. So I think I just thought that was really important point that you bring up about, we have to be able to prime and have that relationship and that trust with self to really be able to access the exiles, you know, that we're trying to unburden.
Because otherwise, if we don't, then it is just old school bad trauma therapy where we are bulldozing or jackhammering to get to what one might consider the ouch or the wound. And then that actually does more damage to our internal system than benefit. So it is completely about priming, right? Because, you know, as we're alluding to, the unburdening process has really deep systemic impact. And I use that word systemic very deliberately because it's healing the system, right? So when the exile is healed, as I mentioned, the protectors that have been protecting that particular exile are often released of their extreme role so that they can go back into their preferred role, you know, and within the unburdening process, that is the actual neurobiological corrective experience that allows, like, that's the generalizable evidence-based element of IFS that helps change our neural pathways. So the unburdening process is really important for that long-standing change systemically, you know. And again, it's such a funny thing that in IFS we say there's no agenda, but yet we have all these like roadmaps. You know, it's agendaless, agenda-based model, right? Where it's like we're always following the flow and pace and tempo of the system and sort of anticipating getting to the exile to hopefully unburden it. And when I say it, we have more than one exile, but we unburden one at a time, right? You know, and the reason it's so important, this unburdening, is because our exiles are desperate to be heard because they've been in hiding for so long, you know, and their behaviors are what drive our protectors. I should say their burdens are what drive our protectors' behaviors. And our exiles hold really rich, precious gifts, you know, like playfulness and joy and creativity. And so part of the process is inviting in those gifts that they've had to sort of avoid, push away because of their burdens. And so it really is just beautiful work when we get to unburden the next time.
Well, yeah, because if you remember if Amy, you can recall, no,
hopefully we'll see.
No, but if we remember, our exiles are often born out of like those younger years, and so when they get burdened and bogged down by whatever the event or events were that created those wounds, it's like as you go and heal and alleviate that pain to some degree, those things that you just mentioned, playfulness, creativity, like those are very, like childlike qualities a lot of the time that create a lot of, I don't know, meaning in my life when I can connect to them. Nowadays, as a fully formed and fledged adult, most of the time at least. Okay, so if you will go over, you know, briefly, I guess the steps. We've sort of talked about the point of unburdening just now being to alleviate the wounds and then create a new openness for the rest of the system that's protecting that exile. When we're talking about doing that in therapy with someone who is credentialed and trained, what, I guess, does that look like?
Yeah, so people often say, well, does it happen fast? Can that get done in one session? It can happen fast. It can happen slow. It can take years for some systems, depending on.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, probably, you know, if you ask Dick Schwartz, he'd be like, no, it should never take a year. I personally know that with a lot of the trauma survivors I work with who have really chronic, severe, complex trauma, especially around attachment injuries, it can take a while for their systems to get to a place that their protectors soften back enough and unblend enough and give permission to move to the exile. So it can take a hot second. For some systems who are more ready, primed, if you will, where there may be more inherent trust between the parts and self, sure, an unburdening can happen in a session, right? The unburdening itself, once you get there, super fast, actually. It's it's doing the 6 Fs over and over and over and over and over and over and over again with like whack-a-mole of protectors that takes the time, if that makes sense. So it's the unblending that usually takes the most time.
That was my question, is like, okay,
Yeah.
so is it just to gain more understanding? Because I've only known my own experience of unburdening, you know what I mean? Whereas you're practicing this. So that was my question, is like, well, it seems like, yeah, that process happens in a session of the actual unburdening. And then, there's kind of like follow-up to be done. But the year-long thing, I was like, oh, whoa, how would that look? So it's getting to know the system and gaining relationship and trust. Okay. Okay.
So usually once a system has given us permission to move to the exile, that doesn't take very long at that point, because remember, I mentioned exiles are desperate to be heard. It's the getting to that place that can take time, right? So, if you were to think of the healing process in IFS, getting to the unburdening almost in 3 stages or 3 chapters. We've got the unblending, which is where we're really differentiating our parts from self. Then in that, this to me is almost one and the same, but there's really that relationship building, rapport building, trust building, right, between parts and self. And then we get to the healing steps. So we spend a lot of time doing the 6 Fs, where we're unblending, getting to the target part, working our way, think of it almost as a tree where we've got these limbs, and those are all of our parts. When we get, choose a target part, that's kind of like the trunk of the tree, where we're working our way down to get to the root system. The trunk is sort of like the 6 Fs, where we stay with the target part. But then, we have another part pop in, which is like another limb that pops out. So then we unblend from that, or do the 6 Fs there, moving back into the trunk, get to the roots, which is where our exile is. And then that's where those healing steps begin. We don't begin unburdening until we have full consent and permission from the protectors to move towards that exile. Once we get that permission, we, in a softish sort of way, really begin the 6 Fs again, but with the exile. Right? Where are you feeling it in or around your body? Go ahead and focus on it. How are you feeling towards it? And we spend a lot of time there because we have to develop a 2-way street also with the exile, from self to exile, and then exile to self. Meaning we have to be able to have self present enough to be able to extend some self energy to the exile. And the exile has to be able to receive it and be able to know who this thing is that's giving it to me. In other words, exile has to recognize that it's self, right? So once we've established that, then that's when the healing steps really begin. I mean, I still think that's all healing leading up to this point, but this is where, the steps of the official unburdening begin to happen. And there's, the first step out of the 8 steps really is what I've sort of just alluded to, that idea of developing a relationship and unblending, and if you will, getting permission. So the first, in my opinion, kind of official step is really where we're witnessing, where the self of the client is witnessing whatever the exile needs it to know. And that's probably the step that can take the longest in the unburdening. Is that witnessing. Now, a lot of clients at this phase often ask, well, does the exile have to tell everything? That would be a part, obviously, asking that question, because self wouldn't ask that. Self can care less, and self can hold it all. And by care less, I mean self has no attachment or judgment to what a part needs to share. So the part gets to decide. The exile gets to decide what it shares. Some exiles do need to share it all, some don't. So within the witnessing, it's like, okay, what more? Is there anything more? Anything more? That's a big question in the witnessing. Paired with a true asking of, does the part feel fully seen, fully heard, and understood? If it doesn't, then we stay there as long as needed. Right? So like I said, that can be the most expansive element of it. But we stay there and we listen until the part feels fully seen, heard, and understood, right? And then after the witnessing, then from there is what is the kind of the first, if you will, corrective experience, which is what we call it's, we kind of call it the redo and or retrieval, both of which need to happen usually. So a redo or a do-over in IFS is where we ask the exile if the adult self of the client, if there's any moment in their experience that caused them to feel the way they did, where they would like the self of the client to enter a scene to help do a corrective experience, to do what they wished an adult or somebody else would have done back then. And that is super, super, super critical, because that changes the neurobiology and how our brain has interpreted and created meaning around one of those events, right? And so that's a really, really rich and meaningful moment that really does need to happen because of that neurobiological shift there. Some of our exiles are quick to say no, they don't need anything, which is fine. But then sometimes we may have to go back and offer that to them later or after. So the redo or, do-over happens, at which point, when that feels complete, we then ask the exile, if it wants to be retrieved, meaning leave that time and place in which all these wounds went down, kind of leave its origin story and come into the present time, or come into a time different than then, right? Where we offer the exile an opportunity to really choose wherever it might like to go. Because remember, our exiles are stuck, most of our parts for that matter, are stuck back when their origin stories were created, back when their wounds occurred, back when the protectors took their jobs on. So most of them are stuck decades ago. And so this is the step in which we're able to bring them back into the more present time, right? So then from there, after we do the retrieval, redo thing, whatever, we might want to call it. In IFS, they call it the retrieval, which kind of includes the redo, but I like to think of them almost as separate steps. We then begin the unburdening, which is an opportunity for the part to release anything it needs to, any of the pain that it's been carrying, any of the wounds, any of the energy, the vulnerabilities, the emotions, the physical sensations, any of that. So we just ask the part if it's ready to unload any of that. We take our time. That's the thing. I think people have a tendency to rush this, especially if they're not trained effectively in IFS. I definitely have a very rigid part that believes fully in getting appropriate IFS training, especially as this model has gained popularity. And there are a bunch of pop-up trainings that kind of do the best they can and don't do the model the sort of justice it deserves. There's immense spaciousness where we're always like, is there more? Is there anything else this part needs to let go of? Is there anything more this part needs to release? And during the unburdening, we bring in the shamanic tradition of using the elements. So when Dick developed this model, he definitely brought in some indigenous elements of it, such as bringing the element, and that's funny, I just said elements because he does bring in the elements, elements in and offer the exile which may they like to release their burdens to, fire, air, water, earth, which is a really rich way of kind of putting it back into the world, if you will. And then after that, we basically ask if this exile wants to bring in any of the positive qualities that perhaps they maybe exiled themselves, such as playfulness, creativity, joy, safety, trust. The part tells us, we don't tell it, right? Like, in all those places that you were carrying these wounds and burdens, is there anything you want to bring in to fill up those places now? Right? And we let them bring them in. And then we go to the protectors, which is where we bring the protectors in to kind of check out the work that was just done with the exile. And we integrate them into the healing to really, really see what they feel now. I would say 80 to 90% of the time, the exiles are like, whoa. There's like a sigh of relief, kind of a collective, like shoulders feeling released. Most of the time, the exiles are just really happy to see the part doing well and playing, right? or running or doing whatever they're doing. And by part, I mean exile. But at this point, it would be a part, not an exile, because it's an exile only because it was carrying pain. So then this is also an opportunity for us to sort of assess and sniff out if the protectors have any burdens that they're carrying. If so, I give them time during another session to unburden, or I'll suggest like, hey, just let the protectors sniff this out over the next week or two. And if they still need attention after that, cool, we'll give it to them. Because sometimes just the newness of it can feel overwhelming to the protectors and they're not quite sure what to think of it yet. Right. And most of the time they feel pretty relieved. But this step of integration of the protectors into the scene to like check out that, you know, the exile, the recently unburdened part now in recent time, that's the corrective experience for the protectors, for them to go, oh, it's not 1982. Whoa, great. Whoa. Like they're able to kind of get updated in that. And that's the corrective neurobiological shift for the protectors for most of them, most of the time. And then after we've done that integration, we then spend a little bit of time setting an intention with the exile to see how does it want to stay in relationship with the self of the client. So the recently unburdened part, how does it want to stay in connection with the self of the client? This is really, really, really important because this is what helps the unburdening stick, if you will. This, you know, we suggest anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks of them consistently, almost on the daily, checking in. Just, hey, how are you doing? This is really helping the client rewire their neural pathways so that corrective change really sticks. And the check-in can be super brief and small, right? Just like a, yo, how you doing? Right? Just bringing the part to mind every day, if you will. And a lot of times the exiles are like, cool, I'm playing. I'm good. Don't bug me. I'm playing. Right? They're like
busy.
Yeah. They're like waving and running away, like playing, chasing frogs or something. So that's the unburdening process, you know, in a nutshell. Right.
Well, and thank you for sharing, because you shared, you know, previously, and I know this, that you did have, you know, there is protection, not protect, well, maybe protectors, but there is protection around it because it is sacred and it is a neurobiological rewiring. And I couldn't help but kind of like, EMDR is also a really, really popular therapy modality for trauma healing. And there is a training, a training and a certification process sometimes. And there is almost like on the clinician's end, like an internal screening of, is the patient or client ready for this? Is this the appropriate, you know, time, place, and otherwise for them to take place in this? And I'm not trying to like crosswire and compare the two, but because of the neurobiology, or the neurobiological change there, that is kind of like the commonality between IFS and EMDR, where it's like, we don't, like, it is slow is fast, pace and tempo. Like, we don't want to just bulldoze, because Amy just explained how like tender, once you get down to that place, sensitive, I guess, how sensitive it can be, where it's not to put pressure on each and every single move that you make, but it is really, there are implications, I guess. We've talked about that. There are implications if it's done wrong, or if you're not in self and it is another part trying to, like, because I've had that happen where it's like, where people have had to slow me down, usually you, where it's like I have parts that like know what's coming, and so I want to get there and I'm burdened, but it's like, wait, that's another branch popping out of that tree trunk, you know, like that we need to slow down.
Yeah, especially if we know the model. I have all sorts of self-like parts who can try to rush the process almost with good intention, you know, and it's still helpful, but it's not a full, real, sustainable unburdening at that point, right? And so, I do consider the unburden. I consider all of IFS really sacred, actually, and especially the unburdening. So I take it super seriously with clients reaching out to have this important, rich work being done, to ensure that they're getting it done by someone who's qualified, and by genuinely qualified, not just because they read no bad parts.
Yeah, somebody that like truly knows the model. And that's not coming from, I just want all of the listeners to know from my heart, and I know Amy's heart, and you can speak to this on your own, but like that's not coming from this egoic place. Like that genuinely is coming from a respect and
it's a reverence.
A reverence. Yes, that's a great word. A reverence for the individual system and the model itself. It's it's not like, oh, on this pedestal, like you have to do all of this, and so it's genuinely there are implications, and we don't like that's beside the opposite of the point of all of this. So.
And I love the word egoic. And I think for me, though, I do have parts that are a bit egoic and self-righteous in it because of the reverence self has for the model, that they can get a bit soapboxy, just because I've seen people bastardize it in ways that are heartbreaking to me. So especially, again, as it becomes more popular. So I'm glad you have more self online. I have a lot of self, and I definitely have some self-righteous parts who are like, y'all make sure you get someone who is at minimum level 1 trained and from the Institute if you're going to start playing in the world of unburdening.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also fair to have some of that ego based on, and this isn't me trying to rescue, or like validate, but it's like based on the amount of time and work and clients, like personal work, client, like, I am sure that you've seen probably people that are like on repeat, try to unburdening take 2 because they've worked with people, potentially that, you've seen the backlash, I suppose, of the system.
Or the amount of clients I end up seeing who think because they've worked with someone who says they know IFS, coming in thinking they know the model, and then their system has been led quite astray.
Right. Exactly. And that's what I mean, where it's like, take number 2, I'm trying to do IFS. And so, okay. So unburdening is the agendaless agenda of IFS. And I think it's really beautiful. I know that it's really beautiful what it's done for me. I love that you've expressed and made really clear that it's not like it just is, because I want that point to be like driven home, where it's like, it's not like you just do this in a session or 2 and then you're unburdened and it's all done. It's like there is really this ritualistic continuation and checking in and listening with that same system, because sometimes it's like, okay, I'm burdened that, let's move on to the next, and it's like, no, that's like re-solidifying those wounds sometimes.
Well, and also this feels important to interject here, is sometimes we may have done a very rich, true unburdening for an exile, and then maybe 3 months, 3 years, 8 years later, there's more that the part needs to release, right? So it's really, the unburdening is like, in this moment, is there anything more? And it may feel complete in that moment. And sometimes there's more, right?
Yeah.
So we're always just staying open to the fact that it's not like a one and done unburdening, that sometimes for some of our exiles, they can need more in time.
Well, and I have a question, like a genuine question for you. So IFS being attachment theory turned inward, we've discussed all of that at some length on the podcast. So if you have any interest there, I think it was in like our self episode maybe, but would you say that the majority, and maybe you can't even answer this, but it's like, would you say that the majority of wounds that the exiles carry are attachment wounds? Because
I have a bias towards yes. Not all IFS therapists would probably agree with that. And I personally have a bias that says yes, but that could very well be my projection based on my own system.
Well, that's why I ask, right? Is because I only know my my system as far as that goes, and I think there is such vast nuance there. So I'm not trying to like say
Right.
to
I'm not, yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
that we're doing, like that it's just attachment wounds. But as I think about the unburdenings that I've done for my own system, all almost they're almost all attachment based. And so when you just said what you said about how they may come up again, they may get activated, there may be more that comes up. It only is sensible, I guess, that that's the case, because we're
in constant relationship.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's kind of where that thought
Yeah.
came from. So
Yeah.
I was curious.
Yeah.
Okay, so unburdening of the exile, and then the rest of the system tends to have some sense of relief, which is very much my personal experience. And that doesn't always mean, Amy, correct me where I'm wrong, that all of those behaviors just fall by the wayside of the rest of
No.
the system, right?
No.
So,
Yeah.
and
And they'll still show up when they need to. How it shifts is they don't show up when they don't need to. That's the difference, right? Like, we don't want to be protectorless, and we don't want to be completely partless, because then we'd be running around the world with our heads up our asses, I think. But, on some level, it's just the protectors then show up when they truly are needed, versus like being at the starting line ready, chomping at the bit for any potential need, even if unwarranted. So that's a big difference.
Yeah, it's almost like they get in touch with, and maybe I'm misusing the language here, but it's like they get in touch with their own, because each part has their own self energy. And so it's like they get in more deeply in touch with their own self energy. So it's like they carry more of those calm, confident, compassionate qualities where, it's really,
that's their baseline, right? That becomes their baseline. And then they jump into more protective mode when and if we truly need.
Which creates I don't want to say like more of a sense of, from like true self or ultimate self, whatever, like more of a sense of understanding of those parts. But it kind of does at the same time, like when I'm in actual self and they're popping up, where it's like, okay, I got you. I know that you're acting out of, because self is also your baseline now. It's like we're kind of on the same playing field, speaking the same level. And I have like more of a appreciation, because I'm like, oh, thanks for showing up right now, instead of like an exploration of like, why are you showing up, this, that, and having to, I don't know if that made any sense, but in my mind, it made a lot of sense.
I think it did. I think I'm tracking.
Okay. Who knows about anybody else, but thanks for understanding and hearing me, Amy. My rambling. Okay, anything else that you're finding without, because again, we don't want to like, this isn't a training, right?
No.
But I'm trying to think, like, I think the gifts of unburdening personally with what we've discussed speak for themselves. Anything else that you're finding really important to kind of like delve into, as far as like making sure our listeners understand the implications that can be had if we're not doing it with someone trained and qualified, and then kind of what it looks like? Oh, I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a naive question based on what we just discussed, but kind of like, I'm not even sure how to ask it, but so, and I think I already know the answer, but could it be said that there is some level of unburdening that I can do myself on a day-to-day? I don't think unburdening is the right word to use, but my thought is, so as I'm moving about the world in self, and I've gotten to know these certain systems and these certain parts of me, and I'm acting out of self, and that system is watching self move about the world, could that also not be like some, or what would we call that? Like it's gaining trust, relief.
We would call
so
it
just
relief.
gaining, yeah. I mean, it's
relief
just gaining
and
relationship.
spaciousness. It's creating more spaciousness in the system, which thereby gives more relief, and I think, so that would not be defined as unburdening. However, I think relief feels pretty amazing, right? So to me, it's relief. And there is no, I think we aspire to this thing that self is going to give us happiness or be the end all be all, the more self we have. No, self gives us more awareness. Yeah. And so that moving about the cabin, day-to-day stuff gives us more awareness, which gives us more relief.
Well, and I guess, I just answered. I like went back into the beginning of the episode where we talked about the priming, because that is the priming. Like as I'm moving through, whether I've unburdened that aspect of the system or not, as I'm moving about the world and self, it is just this relationship building and this trust building. And so I can ultimately have those parts understand that, like, I got this and I care. And then when we get to that vulnerable space. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Think of a new relationship, whether a friend or a partner or romantic, whatever. We're usually all pretty uptight in the beginning because we don't trust it well enough. But once you trust it, you start settling in and find some safety and some spaciousness and some fluidity and even the capacity to be vulnerable in a reciprocal sort of manner. That's the same with our internal system, right? So that sense of relief happens where we're like, oh, everyone can trust each other just a little bit more now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think my brain made those connections because I have unburdened and had that experience of like the daily relief, and they are not the same. And there are a lot of commonalities between that, like,
the exhale.
Yeah. So
more ease, more ease in the system. Yeah.
Well, I love you so much.
I love you so much.
I love you so much. Thank you. I want to hear, we haven't done the sharing of a part that we've been kind of working with recently. And so I want to hear just super briefly, or take as much time as you need. But
okay. So my catastrophic part, I had to do some serious work with her on Sunday. Sunday. And then I'm grateful for all my parts, but for gratitude for her and a lot of work with her. And then yesterday I had to do a boatload of work with an insecure old granny athlete part of mine.
I know the backstory of that. Yeah. So it just makes me chuckle a little bit.
Yeah.
I love those. I've had, I don't have like, I guess I've had, kind of like an insecurely attached part. One of my many come up recently as I'm kind of entering, some new stuff. And so that.
Oh my God, you were just so vague right there, but go ahead. I know what Megan's talking about too.
Well, it's it's intentional. I'm not trying to, not trying to overshare, but, it's funny to have this episode be one that we're talking about today because there's a lot of, whether it's the same, I haven't explored formally enough to really know internally whether it's kind of some of what we actually just talked about, of very similar parts that I've unburdened, or the same part that I've unburdened in exile energy there. But it's so interesting because it's coming up in such a mild way compared to the past. It's almost just like a fleeting thought that I check in with and pay attention to.
Which could also be normal.
I know, based
figure. On some of the stuff you're engaging in. It could also just be normal.
It could also just be normal. And the quote unquote stuff, I just want to clarify, it's not like sex work or drugs.
Oh my God. Not that anything is wrong with those, because all parts are welcome.
All parts are welcome, but there's no firefighters or things coming up in that way. I don't know why when you said some of the quote unquote stuff, I was like, maybe let me just clarify that nothing's like that big of a thing in my life. But wow, I couldn't have rambled or been more vague with that answer, could I? And we're keeping it there, people. I'm not disclosing shit. All right. Well, people, with that, I hope that everybody enjoyed. As always, thank you, Dr. Amy Crawford, for your time. Be sure to leave a review on Apple, Spotify. You guys, Spotify, I don't think does like actual reviews. All you have to do is go and do stars. And I don't know that I could thank you enough for doing that. It truly, like when we say it goes a long way, it really, really goes a long way with algorithms, etc., and getting us more listenership. So if you have been enjoying, please, please, please take the, 0.2 seconds. I will beg. I will beg. I am not above it. And then go ahead and give us a follow on Instagram. Our handle is @turninginpod. We want to keep coming at you with really great IFS content. So we'll keep doing that and delivering. We've got some really cool episodes upcoming as usual. And thanks again for your time. Love you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.